This is one of the most mysterious, most analysed and most disputed paintings of the past 600 years. The painting is the magnificent Arnolfini Portrait, painted by Jan van Eyck in 1434, and in today's video we'll explore some of the mysteries presented by this painting and consider what they can tell us about ToK, and what ToK can tell us about this enigmatic painting. Welcome to ToK Today. I'm Daniel and I enjoy writing and vlogging about the theory of knowledge. The Arnolfini Portrait, painted by Netherlandish painter Jan van Eyck in 1434 in the Flemish city of Bruges, is a very special piece of artistic knowledge that can help us to develop our understanding of all areas of knowledge. That's right, what we can learn from this painting doesn't just apply to the arts, it equally applies to natural sciences, maths, history and the human sciences. To simplify today's analysis, I'm going to consider the painting at three levels: the level of object, the level of subject and the level of interpretation. So let's start with object. In ToK terms, we're talking about objective knowledge and objectivity. So objectively, what do we have? This is a painting in egg tempera on a wooden board, and it depicts a man and a woman in a room. We might assume that they are a couple. Most people assume that they're a couple because of their position in the picture and because they're holding hands, sort of holding hands. And there we have our first piece of ToK learning. Knowledge is often based on assumption, inference and interpretation. Objectively, we can see that their hands are touching. Therefore, we build a subjective assumption from this objective knowledge, that they're a couple. So let's get back to the objective knowledge in this picture. Both figures are depicted wearing robes. These robes appear to be lined in fur. The lady is wearing a large fur-lined green robe that she appears to be pulling up at the front to reveal a second blue-coloured robe underneath. Also portrayed in the room are various objects, including a small dog at the lady's feet, a pair of shoe-like objects to the left, a large mirror in the centre, a chandelier, a bed on the right, and oranges to the left. Now I mention these objects because they may be of significance when we get onto the next section on subject and the following section on interpretation. Objectively, we can see that the picture is highly detailed. If we zoom in, we can see an incredible level of detail in every area of this picture. To emphasise just a few highlights of this picture, let's start with the chandelier. The technical mastery in painting such a complex shape so flawlessly is remarkable. Look at how Van Eyck has depicted the light reflecting off the texture of the burnish of the brass, and even the detail of the spent wax from a depleted candle. Another area of incredible detail is the depiction of the dog's fur. It looks like photorealism painting, if not even a photo, yet we have to remember that this was produced 500 years before photography was invented. And there are incredible details all over this painting, but the final area that I'll focus on here has to be the mirror. The mirror not only shows the reflection of the backs of two people in the room, but it also shows that there are two more people looking into the room. Now, this may be of significance later when we get on to other forms of analysis. Now, look at the 12 circles around the mirror. Each one of those circles depicts a scene from the Passion. That's Christ's final days before his crucifixion. But it's not just a depiction of the scenes from the Passion. It's a depiction of those scenes behind tiny panes of glass. Van Eyck has managed to portray tiny paintings behind glass in a painting. The detail in this mirror alone has intrigued art historians for centuries. Even the amber beads hanging next to the mirror have the reflections of objects in the room painted onto them. Now, I could go on about the details in this painting, but let's use the idea of detail for our next bit of ToK learning. And that's the relationship between the elements and the whole. The Arnolfini portrait isn't constituted by any single element of detail. For example, if some of the dog hairs were not painted in such fine detail, the overall impression and understanding of the painting would not be significantly diminished. However, without the combination of all of the details, we wouldn't have the overall painting, i.e. the painting is the sum of its elements or details. However, the painting is also more than the sum of its elements or its details. It's synergistic. When we combine all those detailed elements together, we get something greater than the whole. And the ToK learning here is that knowledge is often not linear, it's not merely cumulative. It's often more than the sum of its objective parts. The combination of those objective parts makes a greater whole. Further, we add subjective knowledge to that objective knowledge in order to make sense of it. And it's that subjective knowledge that we'll go on to next. However, before we move on to the subject level, please could I ask you to press the like button if you're getting value from today's video and consider subscribing to my channel. It would be a great honour if you would subscribe. Thank you. Now we're going to take a rather narrow definition of the level of subject here because we want to separate subject and subjectivity from interpretation. So let's just narrow subject down to being the direct opposite of object. If the object level is the physical object, then the subject level is taken as what is the subject of this object? What is it depicting? What is it portraying? In other words, what is its subject? Obviously. Now, obviously, there'll be some crossover with the interpretation level, but I'll try to keep them as separate as possible for the time being. So the first subject question is obviously, who are the man and woman who are portrayed in the painting? For many years, it was unclear who the man and woman were. Some art historians believed that it was a portrayal of members of the Burgundian court, the House of Burgundy. Others hypothesized that it could be a wealthy Flemish trading couple, and some even believed that it was the painter himself, Jan van Eyck, and his wife. However, in 1934, art historian Erwin Panofsky published his seminal article Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Portrait in the Burlington magazine, making the case that the couple are Giovanni di Nicolau di Arnolfini and his wife Giovanni Sanami. So here we have our next piece of ToK learning, and that is about labelling and its subsequent effect on knowledge. One knowledge producer, art historian Panofsky, has made a compelling case that this is Giovanni di Nicolau di Arnolfini and his wife Giovanni Sanami. So now the painting is labelled the Arnolfini Portrait. We generally accept that the subject of the painting is Giovanni Nicolau di Arnolfini and his wife Giovanni Sanami, and we've even labelled the painting after them, and consequently we interpret the meanings of the painting in terms of that label. However, what seems like accepted knowledge, possibly even factual knowledge to most of us, is also contested knowledge. And until recently, it was highly contested knowledge. And it's still contestable for some art historians. However, because we've attached a label to the object, we now understand the object in terms of that label. If we attached a different label to this object, we might understand it in different terms and derive different meanings from this same object. For example, I was talking to a student the other day about this portrait, and she observed that the man looks like a rather famous world leader, current president of a country, and then that sort of changed my impression of this painting. Now, I'm not going to name the painting after that very famous world leader, but now I sort of, every time I look at the painting, I see that man there as well. She's labelled it in a different way, and that's changed the meaning for me. But just quickly going back to Panofsky's claim, the claim that most of us accept, that this is Giovanni di Niccolò Arnolfini and his wife Giovanni Sanami, we know that this is a problematic claim because we know that this painting was made in 1434. It's dated. However, Giovanni di Niccolò Arnolfini didn't marry Giovanni Sanami until 13 years later in 1447. And even more problematically, Van Eyck died in 1441, so he wasn't around when they got married. And there are all sorts of theories and explanations for these date discrepancies, which I won't go into here. They're not the focus of this video, but they do give us another bit of ToK learning. Knowledge, which seems obvious, logical and sensible, may not actually be what it appears to be. There have been many examples in all areas of knowledge when what appeared obvious, sensible and logical was later disproved by new knowledge and new findings. And what we think we know to be very obvious today may turn out to be very wrong in the future. Now, after trying to establish who is depicted in the painting, the next big issue of subject is, what are they doing? Objectively, we can see that they're stood next to each other in a room. The man is holding his right hand up whilst holding the lady's right hand in his left hand. She is holding the front of her robe up at the waist level with her left hand. He is facing front with eyes looking to the left towards her, and she is turned towards him looking down in his direction. Now, this is all that we can say that they're doing objectively. To say more than this requires interpretation of the various elements of this painting, including their stances and the objects painted into the picture around them. Now, before we get on to that interpretative level of the painting, I'll just tell you that there are three main theories of what is depicted in this picture. The first theory is that this is the signing of a wedding contract, or it is a wedding contract. The second theory is that this is an actual wedding, or the aftermath of the wedding. And the third theory is, sadly, that this is a memorial picture, that one of these people has actually passed away at the time of the painting, and the painting is a memorial to that person. Now, establishing the substance for each of these theories requires interpretation of the evidence, and that is our next level of analysis. Interpretation of evidence is a key process in producing knowledge, regardless of the area of knowledge. Mathematicians and scientists have to interpret evidence to produce knowledge just as much as historians and artists have to interpret evidence. In 1934, art historian Erwin Panofsky wrote the paper Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Portrait, which is published in the Burlington magazine. Just in case any of you want to read it. Panofsky interpreted the objects in the painting to explain the subject and the meaning of the painting. And this process for the production of knowledge has become known as iconology. The process makes great use of symbolism, as you'll see soon. Panofsky argues that this painting has a specific purpose. He argues that the painting is a legal document. He says that it serves as a pictorial marriage certificate. He arrives at this interpretation because in 15th century Catholic practices, mutual consent, rather than the presence of a priest, was sufficient for a valid marriage. And further, the unusual Latin inscription on the wall behind the couple reads, Johannes de Eyck Voigt Hic 1434. And that means that Jan van Eyck was here in 1434. And this is seen as Van Eyck acting as a legal witness to the event. The actual way that he's written it is the way that legal documents were written in the 15th century in the Netherlands. So here we have another link to ToK. The function of the painting, according to Panofsky, is that it's a legal document. Obviously, it could also serve all the usual functions of a painting. For example, it's a form of entertainment, it's a talking piece, it improves the aesthetics of a room, etc., etc. And this demonstrates that knowledge can have several functions at the same time. This may seem like an obvious point, but it's useful to remember when writing the ToK essay. Additionally, remember that the multiple functions of knowledge can sometimes come into conflict with each other. Now, Panofsky gives us further evidence that the painting is a marriage contract between Giovanni de Niccolao de Arnolfini and his wife Giovanni Sanami through the interpretation of the symbolic meaning of many other elements of the painting. For example, he argues that the joined hands of the couple is a gesture of fidus manualis, faith by hand, symbolising the sacred bond of marriage. He says that the single burning candle in the chandelier represents the presence of God as a witness, a common symbol in the medieval weddings. And the dog at the feet of the woman symbolises fidelity and loyalty, and this is seen as fitting for a marriage portrait. Now, the mirror reflects not just the couple, but also two additional figures, possibly witnesses, and they're surrounded by medallions depicting scenes from the Passion of Christ, reinforcing the sanctity of the union. The statue on the bedpost is of St. Margaret, and she's the patron saint of childbirth, and maybe this is hinting at the couple's hope for fertility. Here, lots of people look at this painting and they think that the lady is pregnant. Most art historians say that she's not depicted as being pregnant, but she's showing all of the abundant gowns that she's wearing as a display of wealth. And this is quite common in sort of medieval painting, that the lady draws up all of her robes to show, look, this is how wealthy I am. This is all the stuff I have. So finally, Panofsky suggests that Van Eyck's prominent signature indicates his role not just as an artist, but as an official witness to the marriage. And this dual role reflects the unique status of artists like Van Eyck in the Burgundian court, where they held quasi-diplomatic positions, a little bit like Hans Holbein for Henry VIII in the Tudor court. Obviously, this is a time before cameras, so paintings were a form of record. Now, I could go on discussing the analysis of this painting. I find it simply fascinating, if you hadn't noticed. But today we're looking at it as artistic knowledge and the theory of knowledge. The way in which Panofsky interprets the symbolic meaning of the objects in the painting to develop a narrative understanding of the painting is a process that's not solely confined to AoK, the arts. In other AoKs, evidence can have a meaning beyond that which it ostensibly presents. And this is most obvious in AoK history, in which objects and behaviours are interpreted according to context and assumed cause to have meanings beyond their objective state. However, this is also evident in human and natural sciences and even mathematics. Darwin's finch's beaks weren't just varied shapes of beaks, they weren't even solely convenient shapes for getting at preferred seeds and fruits, but they meant a whole explanation for the development of life itself. So much of our most important knowledge comes from the interpretation of evidence. Interpretation is so important because it allows us to know things that are not empirically, objectively present. However, knowledge produced through interpretation is far more contestable than knowledge produced solely from observable, empirical evidence. And so this is also the case for the explanation of what's being depicted in the Arnolfini Portrait. Some art historians have a very different interpretation of the painting from Panofsky's. In his 1998 book, The 15th Century Netherlandish Painters, art historian Loren Campbell suggests the possibility that the Arnolfini portrait is actually a memorial portrait of the wife, perhaps created after her death. He cited his key evidence, firstly, being that the woman's expression and posture, which have a solemn, almost ethereal quality, and this contrasts with the more dynamic stance of the man. Loren also looks at other symbolic details that could reflect themes of mortality. For example, the single lit candle in the chandelier is above the man's head, whilst the candle above the woman's side is depleted and extinguished, possibly symbolising life and death. Further, the woman's pale skin and stillness may reflect an idealised posthumous representation. And finally, the presence of the convex mirror, which is often associated with reflections on life, death and eternity. Now, in 2003, art historian Margaret Costner built upon Campbell's ideas in her article, The Arnolfini Portrait, a memorial for Giovanni's wife, which is also published in the Burlington magazine. Costner argues that the portrait was commissioned by Giovanni de Nicolau de Arnolfini in memory of his deceased wife. However, who this wife is unclear. As I told you earlier, Giovanni de Nicolau de Arnolfini didn't marry Giovanni Sanami until 1447, which is 13 years after the Arnolfini portrait was painted and 6 years after the death of Van Eyck. So maybe Giovanni de Nicolau de Arnolfini had an earlier wife who died young and is depicted in this painting. Or maybe, as some art historians have proposed, the painting depicts another member of the Arnolfini family, such as Giovanni di Arrigo Arnolfini. Now here's some key ToK learning. We have a single object, a piece of evidence in ToK terms, yet there are vastly contrasting interpretations of this evidence, giving rise to different perspectives and ultimately different knowledge. Again, such differences are not necessarily confined to AOK the art. We find similar issues with interpretation and perspective in all the other AOKs. However, interpretation remains a fundamental and significant process for producing knowledge that goes beyond that which is physically evident. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you want more details, please follow the link from the video description, and please remember to hit like and subscribe for more content from the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Stay ToKtastic, my friends.